What's going on, guys? It's Zach here, bringing you guys another fantasy football video. And this one, I'm going to be going over my top 24 wide receivers and putting them into a bit of a tier list here. Shortly after this video, and once I get the tight end tier list video as well, I'll go to my website and I'll update that with my tier-based rankings as well, so you guys can have all those for free. That'll go much deeper than the top 24 as well. So if you want more players than what I'll touch on here, I just didn't want to make the video 96 players long and make it a 2-hour long video. So decided to settle for 24 wide receivers here. I love making these videos. I think it's a really useful exercise in terms of identifying where the tier gaps or tier breaks are for each wide receiver or for the wide receivers. It really helps come draft day, knowing that just standard rankings aren't exactly the best way to go about things throughout your draft. You need to understand that if there are a lot of players left in a tier, then maybe you can wait on taking a player at that position in favor of taking a player who's the last good player in a tier. It's just a good way of understanding how the value of a player differs from a player that's even one draft spot ahead of him. There are often some pretty big drop offs from the fourth best wide receiver to the fifth, for example, and I think that it's really important to know where those are so that you can make sure you capitalize on that. So let's get started here. My wide receiver one in my rankings, and clearly going into S tier is going to be Justin Jefferson. I don't know what more there is to say about Justin Jefferson. He's the first 23-year-old to have an 1,800-yard season last year. He honestly has an outshot shot at 2,000 receiving yards again this season. He's just probably the best wide receiver in the NFL. He's on a team that's going to pass the ball more than anyone else in the NFL as well. And he's got some more help coming in this offseason as well. He's going to have Jordan Addison on the other side, maybe to help take a little bit of pressure off of him. Not that he needs it. We'll see what happens with Jordan Addison. He did just get cited for reckless speeding. He was driving 140 miles per hour in a 55 mile per hour speed limit zone. So we'll see what happens there. But I don't think that's going to impact Addison's ability to be on the field. And Osborne and Hawkinson are really involved too. Kirk Cousins, a really quality quarterback as well. So Jefferson's probably going to finish as the wide receiver one. You could make a case for him being in a tier of his own here, but I think he's just barely. I'm not going to give him his own tier, but you really could argue that. So then my wide receiver two in my rankings, I've actually got Tyreek Hill as my wide receiver two. I think he is certainly belonging to being up here. He's just very clearly another player that has a legitimate shot at 2,000 receiving yards. He's a guy that's super explosive with the ball in his hands. He was on pace for 2,000 receiving yards if Tua had stayed healthy last season. And I think that it's just really clear to me that Tyreek Hill is the alpha in that offense. He's going to be what makes that offense tick, and I have no problem taking Tyreek Hill as the wide receiver two, although I think a lot of people would disagree and have Jamar Chase at two. My wide receiver three actually is going to be Cooper Kupp. Let's see if we can find him here, but regardless, Cooper Kupp's another guy that, assuming health, is just going to be a wide receiver one, top five wide receiver again this season. He was on pace to be the wide receiver one in fantasy last season prior to his injury, so I have no problem if you really want to take Cooper Kupp as your wide receiver one. He's just very clearly the only real weapon in this Rams offense that anybody's scared of, and they really can't do anything about it. He's going to get a 30% target share. It's going to be coming from a quality quarterback in Matthew Stafford. So if Stafford can stay healthy, if Kupp can stay healthy, I bet he finishes as a top three wide receiver again. There is some risk associated with that, just given that there is a non-zero possibility that Cooper Kupp or Matthew Stafford deals with injury again this season, but outside of injury, there's just no way Cooper Kupp busts this year. And then the last player that I'll be putting in S tier, although he's actually ranked fifth in my rankings, ahead just behind Davante Adams, so I have ranked fourth. I think there's just a little bit more risk associated with Davante Adams. I think I'm gonna actually want to revisit that ranking, so stay tuned for that. But my last player that I'll be putting in S tier is going to be Jamar Chase. He's just very clearly an elite NFL wide receiver. He's certainly going to finish this season as a top five wide receiver if he can stay healthy. Joe Burrow's only getting better and better throughout the course of his career. He's an elite NFL quarterback. This is the team that's really letting Joe Burrow be the reason that they're winning football games as well. I think that I'd be shocked if Jamar Chase finished outside the top five at the position. He's just a really talented player with a really good quarterback on an offense that's going to throw the ball a ton. There's not really much more to say about him. He's going to be a stud, and I have no problem drafting him, even as high as wide receiver one if you want to. So up next, my wide receiver four, but going to be the first player in A tier. I would actually, despite my projections, put Davante Adams as my wide receiver five, just because I think there's some risk associated with the quarterback position there. Davante Adams going to go in here as my first player in A tier. Just looking for him here, but the only real concern with Davante Adams is going to be the quarterback play. He's obviously moving from Derek Carr to Jimmy Garoppolo. I don't think that's a very significant downgrade for him. Jimmy Garoppolo has a better completion percentage, average yards per attempt, higher touchdown percentage throughout the course of his career. I think that a lot of that could be just credited to the system that he's been in. But Jimmy Garoppolo is an average quarterback. I think Derek Carr is right about average as well. So Davante Adams shouldn't really have any trouble in this offense. The main knock against Davante Adams last year was that he was getting a downgrade at quarterback, and he kind of just proved that it really just doesn't matter. I think from a talent standpoint, you could argue that Davante Adams is still the best wide receiver in the NFL. I would give that to Justin Jefferson and put Adams as the second best, but there's certainly an argument to be had there. I think that just in general, Davante Adams is going to get a 32% target share. This is going to be a team that's going to give up a lot of points because their defense is bad. There's even a possibility that Josh Jacobs holds out, and this is just going to have to be a really pass-heavy team. And if that happens, Davante Adams could easily just smash his expectations. He is a player that has legitimate wide receiver 1 overall upside. The only reason I have him in A tier instead of S tier is because I think there's a little bit of concern that Jimmy Garoppolo could be a problem. Maybe they'll try and be a lower passing volume offense. Maybe they'll try and slow down their pace of play compared to what they did last year, but I almost wanted to put Davante Adams in S tier based off my projections. He's actually one spot ahead of Jamar Chase, but there's just a little bit of risk there, so that's why he falls into A tier here. Next player in A tier is going to be Stefon Diggs. He's ranked as my wide receiver 6 with an ADP of wide receiver 5. Really nothing else that needs to be said about Stefon Diggs. He's a really talented player. He's got Josh Allen throwing him the ball. There were some sort of off the field arguments that were had between Stefon Diggs and his coaching staff. I don't think that's going to be any reason to be concerned about this. They added Dalton Kincaid in the offseason and not really much else. This is going to be basically them running it back. Stefon Diggs is still young enough. I believe he's 29 right now, going to turn 30. He's still young enough that he's going to end up being perfectly fine to finish this season. He's probably got 1 to 2 really good elite years left in him, and he's just Josh Allen's favorite target. This is a team that throws the ball a ton. They're going to score a ton of points. Stefon Diggs has a very legitimate shot. Again, he could certainly be a player that finishes as the wide receiver 1. I would put him as the 6th most likely player to do that probably, but I think that Stefon Diggs is certainly more than capable of putting up a monster season this year, and if he's your wide receiver 1 in your fantasy team, you've got nothing to be worried about. And then moving on to my wide receiver 7, the guy who is also being drafted at an ADP of wide receiver 7, I've got CeeDee Lamb. He's also going to slide into A tier. I think he's just a little tiny bit below Stefon Diggs and Davante Adams, but I don't think there's a huge tier gap there. He's going to be the wide receiver 1 for Dak Prescott. My only real concern here is that they might try and slow down their pace of play this season, try and really lean on that defense and running game. I don't think they really have the personnel to do that unless they add another running back, so we'll see what happens there. If Pollard enters the season as the only running back that's really proven anything on this roster, then they'll probably just have to air it out with Dak and Brandon Cooks, CeeDee Lamb, Michael Gallup, and if that's the case, then CeeDee Lamb's certainly got top 5 upside in this season. I think he'll probably finish in that wide receiver 5 to 10 range. I just think he's a really talented player that's just not going to get quite enough volume, not quite enough touchdown scoring on this offense to be a truly top 3 talent or top 3 producer this year, but he's got a really safe floor. He's a really good player. He's got a decent enough quarterback, and I think he's just a really rock solid wide receiver 1 for your fantasy team if you want him. Moving on to my wide receiver 8, this is going to be the first player I'm going to put in D tier or C tier, and it's Chris Olave. See if I can find him. There he is. Chris Olave is a player that I'm projecting to take a huge step forward this season. I honestly think of the 3 wide receivers that showed out last season of rookies between him, Garrett Wilson, and Drake London. I think Chris Olave is the most talented, and I also think he's got the best quarterback this season. I think that Derek Carr at this point in his career is better than Aaron Rodgers. He's certainly a huge upgrade over Andy Dalton and Jameis Winston, which is what Chris Olave dealt with last year. And Derek Carr showed last year that he's more than willing to hyper-target his wide receiver 1. We saw Davante Adams get a 32% target share with Derek Carr at quarterback. I'm currently projecting Chris Olave for a 27% target share. He's just by far the best wide receiver in the Saints offense. I know Michael Thomas had his time in the sun, but that's come and gone. I really like Rashid Shaheed as like a deep threat gadget guy for this offense, but this offense is going to run through Chris Olave, and Olave is certainly, he's just a stud. This is going to be a team that's going to need to score some points as well. They're going to be a much better offense than they were last season, and Chris Olave, like I said, I think he's just a super talented dude. I think he actually has top 3 wide receiver overall upside. He's a guy that's a super elite deep threat. We saw him really break out last season, especially with Jameis Winston and airing it out for him. If Derek Carr is anywhere close to that and willing to throw the ball deep to Chris Olave, I think Chris Olave is just going to have a monster year, and I really want to get Chris Olave on my teams. I think he's certainly got a ton of upside. I'm not worried at all about him if he's my wide receiver 1 on my fantasy team. Moving on to my wide receiver 9, next guy who I'm also going to put in B tier is going to be A.J. Brown. A.J. Brown, he's just a really talented player. He's very clearly the wide receiver one for the Philadelphia Eagles. And this is going to be a team that's going to pass the ball a ton again. They were really effective at doing it last season. The only real concern would be just touchdown upside. We saw him score 10 touchdowns last season. And Jalen Hurts only threw, I want to say, 25 passing touchdowns last season. I could be wrong on that. I don't remember that number off the top of my head. But this is a team that often when they get towards the goal line, their first thought is to run the ball with Jalen Hurts or their running back. So it does sort of limit the touchdown upside for A.J. Brown. But A.J. Brown's a hell of a deep threat. He's a really explosive player. He's not going to be in as high of a passing volume offense as some of these other guys, but he's always just been a super efficient player. I think that there's a world that exists where he finishes as the wide receiver one if he puts up a spike touchdown season and just has some really fluke efficiency. And there's also a world where maybe this Eagles team has to pass a little bit more than they did last year. And if that's the case, then A.J. Brown's got even more upside than this. I'm more than comfortable drafting A.J. Brown. I think he's going to be a really solid low-end wide receiver one this year. Moving on to my wide receiver 10, another guy that I'm going to put in B tier is Amon-Ra St. Brown. I think that Amon-Ra is just he's another player that's just super talented. He's a guy that he's obviously going to be the focal point of this Lions offense. Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery are going to be what makes this ball move for the Lions team. And he's just a really good player. He's super safe. I don't think you can really get much safer than him in terms of your wide receiver one. He's going to be a guy that's probably going to get 150 plus targets this season. Honestly, he'll probably get even more than that. He's super efficient when he's given the ball. They actually used him as a runner some last season as well. He's going to catch 100 passes. He's going to have over 1,000 yards, and he'll probably end up with like 6 touchdowns. But a world exists where he gets the double-digit touchdowns and has an even 120, 130 reception season. And if that happens, he's got legitimate top 5 upside at the position. He finishes the wide receiver 8 last year, despite really missing a little bit of time and playing through some injuries. If everything breaks right for him, he's definitely got top 5 upside. And if he's your wide receiver 1, I think you're more than comfortable with that. And then the last player that I'm going to put in B tier here is going to be Garrett Wilson. I think the Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave, you can really say pretty much the same thing about them. They both put up really respectable numbers last season as rookies. They're clearly elite players in the NFL, and they both got quarterback upgrades. My only concern with Garrett Wilson would be that the Jets actually threw the ball a ton last season. If you remember earlier on in the season, there were several games where we saw Joe Flacco throwing the ball over 50 times, and I think that the pace of play of this Jets team is going to come down this season. They're going to be a team that honestly wants to lean on that defense and run game once Breece Hall is healthy. I think that they'll win more games doing that, and I think that's going to really potentially limit the true upside of Garrett Wilson. I think they're going to be a team that probably passes at like a near middle of the pack rate this season rather than being a team that just passes 700 times again this season. So the volume's going to come down a little bit for Garrett Wilson this year, but on the flip side, they should be just much more efficient, much better targets. I think that Garrett Wilson's probably going to finish right around this wide receiver 10 ranking. I've got him ranked as my wide receiver 11. He's being drafted as wide receiver 9, so I'm a little bit behind ADP on him, but I've got no problem drafting him as your wide receiver 1. I think he's got legitimate upside if this offense actually takes a huge step forward, and obviously he's just a great player. I think he's going to be poised for a great season. Moving on to my wide receiver 12, this will be the first player that I'm going to be putting in C tier. It's going to be Devonta Smith. Devonta Smith, a lot like A.J. Brown, he's just a really talented wide receiver. He's going to be getting a ton of targets from Jalen Hurts. He's a really good player. I think that there's obviously some limited upside for him, given that he just poses to be the number 2 wide receiver in this offense, and that makes it a little bit tough for him to crack that top 10. The other concern I would have about Devonta Smith is that his true breakout came last season during that 5-game stretch that Dallas Goedert missed. With Dallas Goedert on the field, he's much more of like a 2A, 2B to A.J. Brown's 1A. Or A.J. Brown's 1, if that makes sense. I'm saying that A.J. Brown's the clear alpha, and then Goddard and Devonta Smith are sort of a split for that number 2 target in the offense if they're both healthy. I think that there's enough to go around for all 3 of those guys in this offense. I've got Devonta Smith ranked as my wide receiver 13. I think as my wide receiver 12. That's right around where he's being drafted, so I've got no problem with that ADP at all, but there is a world that exists where there will be some inconsistencies for the guys on this team just because, like I said, they're probably not going to be a super high passing volume offense. They're going to want to run the ball quite a bit. They added DeAndre Swift. That could be one other guy that takes targets away from these 3. And it's just kind of tough for all 3 guys to eat on any given week. So every single week, you're probably going to be looking at either A.J. Brown, Devonta Smith, or Dallas Goedert having a down week. I think over the course of the whole season, it's going to be totally fine, but there will be some ups and downs if you draft Devonta Smith. So I think I'm much more comfortable with him as my wide receiver 2 than my wide receiver 1, if we're talking about roster construction there. Up next, my wide receiver 13 is going to be Jalen Waddle. He's another guy. It's sort of the same thing I was talking about with Devonta Smith. He's just a super talented player and a good offense, but the only issue is that he is the number two wide receiver in the offense. Obviously, Tyreek Hill is going to be the more consistent asset. We saw Jalen Waddle's targets actually dropped significantly last season, but he ended up with like 17.6 yards per reception. That's an insane number. He's just a really elite deep threat. He's a really elite player, and I think there's certainly a world where both he and Tyreek Hill are top 10 wide receivers this season. I have him projected to almost do that, and if Tua stays healthy all year, I think Jalen Waddle is going to be absolutely great. He's another guy that I would want to be my wide receiver 2 on my fantasy team, not my wide receiver 1, just because I think there's going to be some ups and downs, given that Tyreek Hill is going to be the guy that dominates targets in this offense. Not saying Jalen Waddle is not going to get his as well, but there'll just be a little bit more inconsistency with Waddle, given that he's not the wide receiver 1 there. But he's a really great player. He's got a good enough quarterback. He's in a great offense. I think there's nothing wrong with drafting Jalen Waddle to be a low-end wide receiver 1, high-end wide receiver 2 this season. Moving on to my wide receiver 14, it's actually Amari Cooper, and this one is a guy that I think every year just gets kind of underranked and then overperforms just a little bit. He's getting an upgrade at the quarterback position, going from the last version of Deshaun Watson to what we saw at the end of last season to what I'm expecting to happen this season. I think Deshaun Watson is going to be much closer to what we saw in Houston. I don't think he'll really ever truly regain that elite form that we saw when he was in the Houston Texans, but I think Deshaun Watson is going to be a much better quarterback this season than he was last year, and Amari Cooper's still young enough that he can get it done. He actually posted one of his best seasons as a pro last year. I didn't see any signs of Amari Cooper slowing down, and he's just going to be the number one target in an offense that should be a little bit better. I'm currently 4 spots ahead of ADP on him, with him as my wide receiver 14 compared to the wide receiver 18 ADP for him. Again, this is a guy that I would want to be my wide receiver 2. He's got some inconsistency issues. It was probably fluky, but his home road splits were really whack last season. If they were on the road, he just didn't perform very well. So that's something to at least take a look at. I don't think it's going to be a huge issue. I think it's more of just a small sample size fluky thing, but he has been relatively boom or bust throughout the course of his career. I think that's going to continue as well. But the upside's obviously there. He's a really talented player. He's getting what could be a top 10 quarterback in the NFL. And this is a team that they've said they want to pass the ball even more. So this could be a setup where he actually could have the best year of his career this season. I think that, like I said, if he's your wide receiver 2, he's a really great wide receiver 2 option. And if he ends up being your wide receiver 1 because you went RB heavy, I don't think that's the worst thing in the world. And then up next, the last player that I've got as in C tier is going to be Keenan Allen. He's ranked as my wide receiver 15, with an ADP of wide receiver 17. I just think Keenan Allen's a really solid player. He's going to get like a 25% target share in an offense that's going to pass the ball a ton. I currently believe that I am projecting the Chargers to throw the ball the second most in the NFL this season. I'm projecting Justin Herbert for over 5,000 passing yards. I think this is just going to be an offense that really just blows up this season. They're all super talented in this offense. Justin Herbert's an elite quarterback. Austin Eckler, Mike Williams, Keenan Allen, Quentin Johnston, their first-round rookie, even Gerald Everett, Joshua Palmer. There's just a ton of weapons in this offense. I think that Kellen Moore is going to help make this offense tick even more than they did last season. So this is going to be a guy in Keenan Allen who legitimately could have over 115 catches this season, and he's going to have over 1,000 receiving yards, especially in PPR formats. I think Keenan Allen's got legitimate wide receiver 1 upside, and obviously touchdowns are a little bit fluky for him. He's never really been much of a touchdown scorer, but if he could find a way to score 6-7 times this year, even more than that because Justin Herbert just puts up a monster season, then a world exists really where Keenan Allen could be a top 7, top 8 wide receiver this year. He's currently being drafted as the wide receiver 17. If he's your wide receiver 2, I think that's really solid, and I think he's actually going to be super consistent if you draft him. I think he's a pretty safe stabilizer for your team. If I'm picking one of these 4 guys in C tier to be my wide receiver 1, I almost lean with Keenan Allen just because I think you're going to get more consistent production from him. Obviously, the concern is injury. He's missed several games each of the last couple of years. That's a little bit concerning. I don't love that, but I also don't want to just project injury for a player. As a slot receiver, it really allows him to be a productive member of the NFL team further into his career. He's not old enough yet that I'm too worried about the injury or his age, so I think Keenan Allen's got one more really good year in him, and I'm willing to take that risk that he could get hurt. But I think the upside's there, and I don't mind his ADP at all. So after Keenan Allen, we're going to move into what I believe is a new tier here, moving on to D tier. The first player I'll talk about is going to be Calvin Ridley. Ridley's a guy who there's just so much unknown surrounding Calvin Ridley. A world exists where Ridley could be a top 5 wide receiver even. He could just be a true alpha for the Jaguars, and the Jaguars could be a team that take a huge step forward as well. If that happens, then Ridley's certainly got league-winning potential. He's also a player that I I'm just right at consensus for him. I actually have him ranked as my wide receiver 16. He's the wide receiver 16 by ADP. And I just haven't found myself drafting much of him. I think there's too much unknown there. I think Christian Kirk's a really quality wide receiver as well, and it's going to be tough for him to really separate as the clear alpha. It's also been 2 to 3 years really since that Calvin Ridley's truly been a productive member of an NFL team. But that being said, the upside's immense there. He could easily be a top 10 wide receiver. I am projecting him to be the wide receiver 1 for this team. I think that's a reasonable projection, and it sets him out to be the wide receiver 16. So I think it's a pretty good spot for him to be drafted. I think I'd want him to be my wide receiver 2 just because there's so much variability in terms of what you can expect from him in his production this season. But if he's your wide receiver 2, I think there's a lot of upside, and I have no problem drafting him there. After Calvin Ridley, I've got Marquise Brown as my wide receiver 17. He's a guy that I'm significantly above ADP on. He's currently being drafted as wide receiver 31 compared to my ranking of wide receiver 17. I think he's just a really good player. He's going to be a guy that's going to be the clear number 1 target in this offense. And I think the Cardinals' offense is going to be a little bit better than what people are expecting. I think Kyler Murray will likely come back probably after, 6 weeks. Kyler Murray himself has said that he wants to be ready for the start of the season, so that could even happen as well. But Marquise Brown, he's a deep threat. He's a really efficient player. He's going to get a target share in the high 20s. And he's a good player. I think he's going to be a really productive boomer bust wide receiver 2 for you, but he's going to get enough targets. He'll be a little bit more consistent than that. I think he's got a legitimate shot to finish as a wide receiver 1 if things break right and Kyler Murray comes back. He was honestly the wide receiver 6 throughout the first 6 weeks of last season. That was without DeAndre Hopkins, which obviously DeAndre Hopkins is gone this season. So he's got that top 10 upside as a wide receiver here. Kyler Murray's probably in a rush to get back so that he can prove himself and keep the Cardinals from drafting a quarterback next season. And I think that Marquise Brown's good enough to help him do that. So I like Marquise Brown quite a bit. If he's your wide receiver 2, and honestly you're drafting him at wide receiver 31, making him like a wide receiver 3 for your team, I think you're just really set there. After Marquise Brown, I've got Tyler Lockett as my wide receiver 18. He's also going to slot right into D tier. This is another guy that I'm just significantly ahead of ADP on. He's currently being drafted as the wide receiver 32, just 1 pick ahead of Jackson Smith-Njigba being drafted as a wide receiver 33. Lockett just every year gets disrespected like this. He's finished in the top 15 at the wide receiver position each of the last 4 years. He is the only player with over 1,000 receiving yards and 8 touchdowns in each of the last 4 years. He's a really good player. He's only 30 right now. He's going to be more than capable of continuing this production for another year or 2. He doesn't take many hits. If you watch him play, he gets down pretty much immediately after every single catch he makes. So there's not too much wear and tear on that body. He's just a really good player. This is an offense that's going to be really good. I think that as you draft Lockett to be your wide receiver 2, he's just going to be a guy that you can play every single week and feel comfortable in. He's obviously got potential for the upside as well. We've seen him be a top 10 wide receiver in fantasy. If Geno Smith could take a step forward, then obviously Tyler Lockett's got even more upside beyond that. So I love the value of Lockett, and I think that he's certainly deserving of being a wide receiver 2 for your fantasy team this year. After Tyler Lockett, I've got T. Higgins as my wide receiver 20. This one's probably a little bit shocking. I was a little shocked after my rankings as well that he statted out this low. The only real concern for me with T. Higgins is the inconsistency. He's just been a guy that is a little boomer bust for my liking. His target share is not actually that massive. He ends up receiving a target share around 20%. It's certainly good enough for him to put up elite numbers given how efficient he is and how efficient Joe Burrow is. So I actually find myself drafting him ahead of this projection. I think he deserves to be in this tier, if not maybe in C tier, despite my projections. I'm going to want to actually go take a double look at those projections because I actually think I would put him in C tier with these guys. But I think between Waddle, Devonta Smith, and T. Higgins, the number 2 wide receivers for their teams, I do believe that T. Higgins would be my 3rd highest ranked there. So maybe D tier is actually right here. I don't have a huge problem with putting him in D or at the end of C tier. Regardless, though, I think that T. Higgins he's a really good player. It's just that he's a little inconsistent given how he is pretty much generally used as a deep threat in this offense. He's a guy that you have 1 week where you get 3 catches for 60 yards, and that's it. And the next week you get 5 for 130 and 2 touchdowns. So there's just a really wide range of outcomes for T. Higgins on any given week. He's not a guy that I would want to be my wide receiver 1, but if he's the wide receiver 2 for my team, I love that upside that he gives me, and I have no problem drafting him there. Even though I have him ranked as my wide receiver 19 with an ADP of wide receiver 14, I have no problem drafting him ahead of all three of the guys that I have in D tier here. I think I probably would recommend that, but I would have him just behind all the other four guys that I have in C tier. So maybe for the sake of just illustration here, I'll put him ahead of these other guys just to show that that's about where I would have him ranked if you want to put him. If you want to put him at C tier as well, no problem with that. So regardless, moving on from T Higgins here, the next player I want to talk about is going to be DK Metcalf. I've got him ranked as my wide receiver 20, and he's going to be the last player that I'll put in D tier. I think it's just very reasonable to have him ranked right next to Tyler Lockett. They've finished pretty much back to back each of the last several years. They get very similar target shares. They're used in honestly very similar roles in this offense. They're both going to be the outside wide receivers in this team, while Jackson Smith and Jigma operates out of the slot. And Metcalf's he's a really good player, but I can't find myself ranking him any higher than this. He's currently ranked as wide receiver 15. I have a hard time separating him from Lockett enough to make that justification. He's going to be a guy that probably is going to rely on touchdowns if you want to see him put up that top 15, top 10 season. So that certainly could happen. I believe he actually led the NFL in end zone targets last season. So a world does exist where he puts up a really spiked touchdown season, but generally Lockett actually scores more touchdowns than him. He's just a more efficient player generally. So I think putting him at wide receiver 20, that's perfectly fine. If he ends up being your wide receiver 2, I think you'll be more than happy with that. So then moving on to E tier, the first player I'm going to put in E tier is Jerry Jeudy. I think Jerry Jeudy is actually a player that could certainly break out this season. I know a lot of people have sort of come and gone in terms of their excitement for Jerry Jeudy. He's been a guy that a lot of people have been really high on for years and just hasn't really truly broken out yet. But I really think this could be the year. We saw Jerry Jeudy look really great during like that 5-game stretch at the end of last season. I think Sean Payton's going to come in and make this offense quite a bit better. I think it's going to make it just it's going to look completely different in Denver this season. Jerry Jeudy's clearly the number one target in this offense. If Russ can bounce back anywhere near his career normals, Jerry Jeudy's got legitimate top 12 upside. I'm currently projecting Jeudy for, I think it's a 24% target share. It's not quite as much as I actually think he could get. I think you could see him dominate a little bit more than that, get towards the high 20s, and really be a true top 15 wide receiver, maybe even top 12. And I don't really see him performing much lower than where I have him ranked here. I think he's just a really talented player. He's going to be a guy that is going to be utilized in this offense quite a bit. Russ is going to be better this year. Jeudy, if he's your wide receiver 2, I think that's going to be a really solid thing for your fantasy team this season. Up next, my wide receiver 23 is Christian Kirk. 22 is Christian Kirk. I've got him ranked just 3 spots ahead of ADP, his ADP being wide receiver 25. And I think Christian Kirk's honestly just a really quality value in drafts this season. I think a lot of people are just overlooking him because of the addition of Calvin Ridley. But don't forget that Christian Kirk finishes the wide receiver 9 in fantasy points per game last season in PPR. He's a really good player. He's clearly got a quality rapport with Trevor Lawrence. And honestly, this is going to be a really good offense in Jacksonville as well. I think that Christian Kirk could easily just be a high-end wide receiver 2 again this season, especially if Calvin Ridley doesn't emerge as a true alpha. I love drafting Christian Kirk. I think he's really great value, and I think he's just going to have a really solid season, especially in PPR formats. So then my wide receiver 23, also in E tier, is going to be Mike Williams. Mike Williams is a tough one because you never really know what you're going to get from week to week. One week he's going to have 1 catch for 5 yards, and the next week he'll have 8 catches for 150 yards and 2 touchdowns, and it's just going to My bad there. My headset cut out. But it's just going to be a roller coaster of a season for Mike Williams. I think that you're going to have to deal with the highs and lows of his production. Obviously, one week he's going to be the guy that can certainly win you your week, and then the next week he could be a guy that gives you a 0. So you just have to keep that in mind. I'm much more comfortable with him as my wide receiver 2 or my wide receiver 3 if I'm playing him in that flex spot. It gives me it's generally how I'd want to construct it. My general view on Mike Williams, he's a really nice wide receiver to have on your roster if you don't need him. Is sort of how I look at him. If I need him to produce every single week, then it's going to be a guy that's just going to make my season really tough. But if he's a guy that's just like he can take your team over the top on any given week, then I love playing him as a flex. So that's why he's a low-end wide receiver 2 for me in my rankings. It really makes sense. I do have him 3 spots ahead of ADP just because I'm super high on this Chargers offense, but just know that it's going to be a really bumpy ride to this overall season finish for him. And then last but not least, my wide receiver 24 is Brandon Ayuk. I think that Brandon Ayuk's going to put together a really solid season for the 49ers. I think that he is the wide receiver 1 on that team. I think the general consensus would be that Debo is, but Brandon Ayuk's the best pure wide receiver on this roster. I think this is going to be a team that is going to put up a ton of points. I think Brandon Ayuk could certainly be a guy that sees 8 receiving touchdowns this season. He looked really good in his splits with Brock Purdy last year, and honestly, it would be surprising to me if both Kittle and Deebo Samuel play all 17 games. And if that's the case, then Ayuk's going to have even more target share come his way in those weeks. So I think Ayuk's going to be a really quality low-end wide receiver too. I think he's got upside just a little bit beyond that as well if things break right. And I think he's just going to be involved enough in this offense that he's a super safe pick. So I love drafting him there. So yeah, that'll do it for my top 24 wide receiver rankings. Like I said, I'll be putting up my tier-based rankings on the website shortly. The rankings have already been up there, but I'll be happy to add those tiers as well so you guys can see how that separates. If there are any questions about these, feel free to let me know. Let me know if you have any disagreements, any players that I left out somehow that you think belong in that top 24. I'd love to interact with you guys there. Just as a recap here, in S tier, I've got Justin Jefferson, Tyreek Hill, Cooper Kupp, and Jamar Chase. In A tier, I've got Devontae Adams, Stephon Diggs, CeeDee Lamb. In B tier, I have Chris Olave, A.J. Brown, Amon-Ra St. Brown, and Garrett Wilson. In C tier, we've got Devonta Smith, Jalen Waddle, Amari Cooper, and Keenan Allen. In D tier, we've got T. Higgins, Calvin Ridley, Marquise Brown, Tyler Lockett, and DK Metcalf. And then in E tier, we've got Jerry Jeudy, Christian Kirk, Mike Williams, and Brandon Ayuk. So that'll do it for this video. If you did like the video, which I hope you did because you watched this far into it, please do take the time to give it a like. It really helps with the channel. It really helps grow things. It really helps me know that I did a good job. And if this is your first time on the channel, I hope you want to stick around and get more content like this. So please do click that subscribe button. You can click the notification bell so you get notification when more videos come out. And I hope I can see you next time. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time. Thank you guys for watching. If you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to the channel, like the video, check out these other videos here if you haven't. If you want more content, please feel free to follow me on Twitter at RealSteelFFB. I'll be more active on there as the season goes on. Thanks. Catch you later.